The wind howls through the empty countryside, the trees swaying under the weight of the cold. Thomas, his hands weathered with age but steady, pulls the jack from the trunk of his old, rusted car. The task is familiar to him, though the physical strain of bending down and maneuvering the tools takes a toll. He grits his teeth against the cold, lifting the car as best as he can, his breath coming out in clouds against the chilling air. Despite his practiced motions, the flat tire is stubborn. His fingers ache, his back protests, and he sighs, pushing through. A soft rattle in the distance catches his attention. As he wipes his brow with the back of his hand, a sleek car approaches, its headlights piercing through the dusk. The car slows down, finally coming to a stop near Thomas's vehicle. The door opens, and a woman steps out, young, tall, and well-dressed. She hesitates for a moment before looking at Thomas, who's still on his knees, struggling with the tire. Her face is a mix of curiosity and impatience as she watches him. "Do you need help?" she asks, her voice flat but polite. Thomas looks up, startled by her sudden appearance but grateful nonetheless. "No, ma'am," he replies, trying to hide the fatigue in his voice. "I'm just fine. Got this under control." She watches him for a moment, her gaze dismissive. Her lips curl slightly, a look of disbelief crossing her face as she surveys his worn clothes and the state of his car. "Well, it looks like you might need some help after all," she says, her tone now dripping with condescension. "You're a bit old to be out here, working on this junk of a car, aren't you?" Thomas's heart sinks a little at her words, but he forces a smile, trying to brush it off. He's heard worse in his life, but something about her tone cuts deeper than usual. He doesn't answer, just continues working on the tire. "Well," she continues, her voice gaining confidence, "you really ought to get someone to help you. Maybe someone who knows what they're doing, who isn't out here playing with their tools like a child." Her words sting, and Thomas can feel the hot sting of tears threatening to rise. He ignores them, focuses on the tire, and keeps working, though every word she speaks chips away at his resolve. "Why don't you get back in your car?" the woman continues as if he wasn't even there. "I'm sure you're more used to sitting in a nice warm car than getting your hands dirty." Thomas takes a deep breath, fighting the lump in his throat. He doesn't look up at her, doesn't acknowledge the cruel edge in her voice. The weight of her words presses on him, but he tells himself he's no stranger to hardship. He's faced far worse in his life. The woman watches for another moment, shaking her head as if he's some kind of unfortunate spectacle. Finally, she turns, her footsteps harsh against the gravel, her car door slamming behind her as she pulls away, the engine purring in the distance. Thomas finally finishes securing the tire, his fingers sore and shaking. He takes a moment to wipe his brow again, the sting of the woman's words lingering like a heavy fog. Despite his age, despite the difficulty of the task, he takes pride in his independence, in his ability to still get things done. But her words, they still echo in his mind. Megan stands by her car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes narrowed as she watches Thomas work. The cold wind whips around them, but she doesn't seem to notice, too absorbed in the judgment she's placed on him. As Thomas bends down to continue his task, she scoffs again, louder this time. "Do you even know what you're doing?" she asks, her tone dripping with disdain. "You really think someone like you can fix something like this?" Thomas doesn't look up at her immediately. His hands are steady, despite the slight tremor of old age, as he works on securing the tire. He's heard words like this before, but today something about the venom in her voice stings harder. For a moment, there's silence. The only sounds are the wind and the distant hum of the highway. He doesn't answer, doesn't allow himself to be dragged into her world of assumptions. He simply keeps working. Megan steps closer, clearly irritated by the silence. She stands a little too close to Thomas, her posture firm as she watches him bend and twist the wrench. "People like you should be lucky you even have a car to fix," she continues, her voice mocking. "I'm sure you're just wasting your time trying to get this thing fixed. What's the point?" Her words are like daggers, aimed at his pride, his sense of worth. But Thomas doesn't flinch. He tightens the last bolt on the tire and stands slowly, wiping his hands on his pants. "I'll be fine, ma'am," Thomas says quietly, his voice calm, despite the heat building inside him. He doesn't want to dignify her cruelty with a response, but something inside him shifts, a quiet resolve. Megan doesn't let up. "You should know your place," she snaps. "There's no reason you should be out here in the cold doing this. Leave it to someone who actually knows what they're doing." Thomas pauses, his hands still on the car as he looks at her for the first time since she arrived. The cold has seeped into his bones, but it's not just the weather that has him chilled. It's her judgment, her casual disregard for his humanity. "I've fixed this car before, ma'am," he says, his voice steady but firm. "I don't need help, and I've got it covered." Megan tilts her head, her lips curled into a thin line. She looks Thomas up and down, scanning him as if he were beneath her. The pause between them lingers in the cold air. Then she huffs, rolling her eyes. "Well, I'm sure it'll break down again soon," she says dismissively. "You can't fix something like this forever. But whatever, it's your time." Her words are cutting, and they hang in the air like a threat. She turns away from him, heading back to her car without offering any help, her high heels clicking sharply on the gravel as she climbs into her vehicle. Thomas stands for a moment, his gaze lingering on the shiny car as it pulls away. He watches as the taillights disappear down the road, the sound of the engine fading with the distance. It's a small victory. He has fixed the tire on his own, but the sting of her words remains, lingering like an open wound. As he walks back to his car, there's a quiet sorrow in his heart. He doesn't want her pity or her condescension, but the weight of being dismissed because of his race, his age, his appearance. This hurts in ways he doesn't often admit. But he shakes it off, getting back in his car and driving away, knowing that the road ahead is long, and the people who look down on him won't be the ones to determine his worth. Thomas's hands were steady, despite the biting cold as he worked on the flat tire. He had done this many times before, and this was no different, except for the cruel sting of the woman's words as they pierced the air. As he bent down to finish tightening the last bolt, he heard her voice again, full of mockery. "Why don't you just call someone who actually knows what they're doing? People like you don't belong on these roads." His heart sank at the words, but he didn't let it show. Thomas had learned long ago to keep his emotions in check. He'd spent a lifetime navigating the world's harsh realities, realities that often told him he wasn't good enough, that his value was determined by the color of his skin and the wear of his clothes. "People like you don't belong," she repeated, her tone thick with disgust. Thomas kept working, trying to block out her words. He focused on the job at hand, tightening the lug nuts and securing the wheel. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him crumble under the weight of her prejudice. The chill in the air was sharp, biting, but the sting from her voice was sharper. "People like you don't belong," she said again, louder now, as if trying to hammer her message into his soul. The frustration inside him threatened to boil over. But Thomas wasn't one to lose control. He had learned to endure. His hands, now rough and calloused from years of hard work, were steady as he finished his task. Her voice continued to punctuate the silence between them. "I bet you don't even understand how this car works. It's way too good for you, isn't it?" The ridicule was suffocating. It reminded Thomas of every moment he'd ever been made to feel less than. The times people had looked at him with disdain, the moments when they had written him off because of his background. Yet there he was, a man who had worked for everything he had, fixing a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. And still, she couldn't see him for what he truly was. Her laugh was a sharp, biting sound that echoed in his mind long after she stopped. But Thomas didn't let it rattle him. He had been through too much to let her words hold power over him. He was used to people judging him based on appearances, but what she didn't know was that he was resilient. He had to be. Every motion he made was deliberate, focused. He wasn't going to let her poison his thoughts or distract him from what he had set out to do. He finished with the tire and stood up, brushing the dirt and snow from his hands. The job was done. As he started to put his tools away, he could hear the faint whispers of the crowd that had gathered. He could sense their judgment, their eyes flicking between him and the woman. The whispers turned to murmurs. He didn't need to hear what they were saying. They made it clear enough with their silence and stares. He walked away from the scene, his head held high. He didn't need to justify his actions. He didn't need their approval. He knew the truth. He had done what was right, and that was enough. Inside his car, Thomas sat for a moment, taking a deep breath. The weight of the day pressed down on him. It wasn't just the tire or the cold. It was the judgment. He felt the ache of it, deep in his chest, but he didn't let it swallow him. He'd faced worse, after all. The world might see him as just another man from the wrong side of town, but he knew better. He knew who he was and what he was capable of. And nothing, not the cold or the harsh words, could take that from him. As he started the engine and drove away, he knew there was more to life than the judgment of others. There were more roads to travel, more people to help. And no matter how many times the world tried to tear him down, he would rise above it. The road stretched before him, and Thomas, steady and strong, pressed on. The world may not always see him for who he truly was, but he knew his worth. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Thomas finished tightening the last bolt on the tire, his hands steady, despite the cold and exhaustion. As he stood up, wiping his hands on the rag, the weight of Megan's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. She was still standing there, arms crossed, looking at him with disdain. The chill in the air seemed to settle even deeper in his bones as she continued to speak. "It must be hard for people like you, huh?" Megan's voice dripped with venom. "I mean, you probably didn't even get an education to understand anything useful." She sneered, her words sharp and pointed, digging into him like a knife. For a moment, Thomas stood still, the sound of her voice reverberating in his mind. He had heard things like this before, hurtful words, dismissive glances, and judgments based on nothing but the color of his skin and the life he led. He'd been through so much in his life that the sting of her insults wasn't as sharp as it once would have been. But hearing them now, from her, felt different. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they seemed to reflect everything he had ever fought against. He could feel the anger building inside him, the heat rising beneath his skin. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to steady himself. He had spent his life working hard for everything he had, scraping by with nothing but his own determination. But the world didn't see that. The world saw his old clothes, his hands covered in grease, and made assumptions. Megan made assumptions. With a calm he didn't feel, he turned to face her. "I've spent my life working hard for what I have," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't need your pity, and I don't need your insults." His chest swelled with a mix of anger and pride as he continued, his words more pointed this time. "I'm not some charity case, lady. I've earned everything I've got, and I'll keep earning it, no matter what people like you think." For a moment, there was silence between them. Thomas felt the weight of his words, the truth of them. He wasn't a charity case. He wasn't a man to be pitied. He had struggled, yes, but he had also persevered, and that was something no one could take away from him. Megan stood there, looking at him with a mix of surprise and disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Her eyes flickered for a moment, then dropped to the ground as she crossed her arms tighter over her chest, perhaps unsure how to respond. Thomas didn't wait for her to find the words. He had said what needed to be said. The anger that had risen in him was starting to fade, replaced by something else, something quieter, more resolute. He turned and began walking toward his car, not looking back at her. His heart was still racing from the confrontation, but as he slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The world might not always understand him, and some people would always see him through the lens of prejudice and assumptions. But that didn't matter anymore. He knew who he was. He knew the value of his hard work, of his resilience, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. As he drove away, the cold wind against his face felt a little less harsh. He had stood up for himself, and in that moment, it felt like he had reclaimed a piece of his dignity. As Thomas started his car and the engine roared to life, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Megan stood there, her arms still crossed, but something about her stance had changed. The sneer had faded, replaced by something less certain, more contemplative. Thomas took a deep breath, his grip on the steering wheel steady, but his mind still replaying the sting of her earlier words. As he pulled away, the distance between them grew, but something unexpected happened. In the quiet of the moment, as the hum of his car's engine filled the air, Thomas felt an odd sense of finality, not in the confrontation itself, but in what had just transpired. The anger that had flared in him was now tempered by a sense of relief. He wasn't going to let her or anyone else diminish the person he had fought so hard to become. But then he heard footsteps behind him. They were hurried, almost apologetic, and Thomas's instincts told him it was her. He didn't know why, but something in his gut urged him to stop. He slowly applied the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. The engine idled as he looked ahead, trying to steady his breathing. He could see Megan approaching in his side mirror, her face now less hard, softer even. Her usual self-assuredness was replaced by a look of unease. Megan stopped a few feet away from the car, hesitating for just a moment before she spoke. Her voice was quieter, lacking the sharp edge it had held before. I'm sorry for what I said," she said, her words hesitant but sincere. "That was wrong of me." Thomas sat still for a second, the words hanging in the air, as if he was trying to process them. For a moment, he couldn't quite find the right response. He'd spent his whole life navigating people like her, those who judged him without ever knowing him, assuming he was less than he was based on nothing but the color of his skin, the clothes on his back, the struggles he faced. But this apology felt different. There was something raw, something real in her voice. He finally turned to face her, his expression a mixture of caution and curiosity. "You didn't have to say that," he replied quietly, his eyes steady on hers. "But I appreciate it." Megan's gaze softened as she took a step forward, her posture more open now, almost vulnerable. She looked down at the pavement for a moment, as if gathering the courage to say more. "I was wrong about you. You have more strength in your words and actions than I could ever have imagined. I want to make things right," she said, her voice genuine. "Please, let me help you. Let me treat you to a meal or something. I want to do something to make up for how I treated you." The offer caught him off guard. After everything, after her cruel words and the assumptions she had made about him, it was strange to hear such an invitation. It wasn't the kind of thing he was used to, and for a moment, he almost didn't know what to say. He had spent so much of his life protecting his pride and dignity from people who didn't care to see past his circumstances. But this felt different. This felt like a true attempt at redemption. Thomas let out a deep breath, looking at her. The hard exterior she had shown was gone now, replaced with a vulnerability that, if nothing else, reminded him that people could change. He thought for a moment about the possibilities, about how sometimes people could surprise you when you least expected it. "All right," he said slowly, a small, guarded smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "One meal." Megan smiled too, the relief on her face obvious. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. For a moment, they stood there in silence, a strange truce settling between them. It wasn't about forgetting what had been said or erasing the past. It was about taking a small step forward. Thomas, a man who had spent years navigating the harsh realities of life, knew that this wasn't just about a meal. It was about finding the humanity in each other, about recognizing the strength and dignity we all carry, no matter the circumstances. As Thomas pulled away, this time he didn't feel the weight of her words on his shoulders. Instead, he felt something lighter, an opportunity for something better, something that might just bridge the gap between them. As the conversation continued, Thomas remained quiet, reflecting on what Megan had just said. The gesture was unexpected, far from anything he'd ever anticipated when he first crossed paths with her. He had assumed their interaction would end with her driving off, as it often did with people like her who didn't see the worth in someone like him. But this felt different. Megan's offer was not about a handout or pity. It was something more profound, more human, a deep recognition of his character, something that had taken her by surprise, perhaps even something she hadn't expected to find in herself. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, a softness that spoke volumes. "You know," Megan began, her voice softer now, "my grandfather isn't around anymore. I've always wished I had a kind, wise man like you to look up to." Her words came slowly, almost as if she was letting herself be vulnerable for the first time. "If you'd allow me, I'd be honored to consider you a father figure, perhaps even my grandpa." The air seemed to freeze for a moment as the weight of her words hung between them. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat, something he hadn't expected to feel, not from someone who had been so quick to judge him, so quick to write him off. He swallowed, trying to gather his thoughts, but his emotions were raw. It had been so long since anyone had extended such kindness to him, let alone in such a genuine, personal way. Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes. It wasn't just the sincerity in her voice, but the acknowledgement of his strength, the realization that she saw him now as more than just an old man, more than just the assumptions she had made earlier. He could barely find the words to respond, but he managed to say, "I'm not looking for anything, but I appreciate your kind words." For a long moment, neither of them said anything more. The quiet stretched out, filled only by the wind rustling the trees around them. It was a moment of mutual understanding, of two people standing together in the shared knowledge that they had both learned something important about each other, about life, and about the humanity that binds them all. Megan took a step closer, and before he could say anything else, she gently wrapped her arms around him in a quiet, sincere embrace. Thomas stood there, unmoving at first, still surprised by the gesture, but slowly he allowed himself to return the embrace, his large hands resting gently on her back. "Thank you," Megan whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for how I treated you." Thomas held her for a moment longer, the weight of his own pride finally slipping away. He wasn't angry anymore, just grateful for the growth that both of them had experienced, for the recognition of his worth, and for the opportunity to be part of something he never expected. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt seen, not just for the color of his skin or the weathered hands that had worked hard all his life, but for the strength and wisdom that had carried him through it all. As they pulled apart, Megan looked up at him, her eyes bright and full of gratitude. Thomas smiled, a rare smile, one that didn't just reach his lips but his eyes as well. "Sometimes the right words come when you least expect them," he said softly, knowing that this moment would stay with him forever. They stood there for a few more moments, not needing to say anything else. For Thomas, the world had shifted. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about knowing that, at least in this moment, he had touched someone's heart in a way that mattered. And for Megan, it was about learning to see past the surface, to open herself up to new possibilities, and to find respect in the most unexpected places. The world wasn't always fair, but moments like this reminded them both that kindness and humility still had the power to heal, to connect, and to change lives. As Megan turned to leave, she smiled back at Thomas, a genuine smile this time, before getting in her car and driving away. Thomas stood still for a moment longer, the weight of her words still lingering in his heart. For the first time in a long time, Thomas didn't feel alone. And as the sun set in the distance, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world had more to offer than he had ever thought possible. Megan stood by her car, watching Thomas walk away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape. A quiet smile tugged at her lips as she reflected on the moment they'd shared. What had started as a tense, hostile encounter had transformed into something deeper, an understanding, a shift in perspective. She now understood what real strength was, not in wealth or status, not in what one possessed, but in the resilience of spirit, in the quiet dignity with which Thomas had faced her ridicule, and later her apology. As Thomas continued down the road, his gait steady and calm, Megan felt a sense of peace settle over her. She saw him not as an old man on the streets, but as a source of wisdom, someone who had lived through struggles far greater than her own, and still carried himself with grace. He didn't need anything from her, yet he had given her something priceless, the reminder that there was more to life than appearances, more than what society chose to value. Thomas's steps were deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't burdened by the past or by the judgment of others. There was a freedom in the way he walked, a quiet assurance that made Megan wish she could carry that same peace with her. As she looked back at him, Megan knew that the world might not change overnight, but small acts of kindness, on both sides, could make a difference. She had learned something that day, that redemption could come in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes the most valuable lessons came from those we least expect. With a deep breath, Megan turned toward her car, her heart lighter, knowing that she had witnessed a small, beautiful moment of change.